This video was made possible thanks to InVideo AI. More details coming up soon. The US seems like a powder keg waiting to explode. Society is increasingly politicized. Election polls predict a fierce battle down to the last vote between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And it basically seems that if you vote for one, you are the enemy of the other. What's more, when we talk good or bad about one of these politicians, there are always people from both sides insulting us in the comments, accusing us of being sellouts, globalists, Freemasons, interplanetary lizards, and everything else you can imagine. The polarization has reached such a point that it seems that you can't even analyze what Democrats or Republicans do or say without getting a wave of hatred in the process. But guess what? Things have not always been this way. A few decades ago, there was a man who united the vast majority of Americans. A man who won elections in 49 out of the 50 states. And he did it with a campaign of hope, of the future, of fellowship, and of work that was very different from the incendiary tone we see today. We're talking about Ronald Reagan.
This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better.
For many, Ronald Reagan represented a shift in the US political paradigm, not seen since the Great Depression and the New Deal. And no wonder. Along with Margaret Thatcher, Reagan was the most visible face of the success of what is often called neoliberalism.
Only by reducing the growth of government can we increase the growth of the economy.
For some, Reagan is a national hero who put the country back on the road to capitalism. He is responsible for the fact that the US is still such a prosperous country that even Hawaii, the poorest state, is richer than the UK or Norway. But of course, if there was one historical milestone that forever marked the former president, it was his role in the disintegration of the USSR.
Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
At the time, Reagan was holistic in the United States, and for many, he is the best president in history. In some circles, however, his reputation is being trashed. The neoliberalism that Reagan spearheaded came to be used more as an insult than a compliment. He was accused of lowering taxes on the rich, of cutting the welfare state, and of abandoning the middle classes, thus increasing inequality in the United States. Who is right? Is Reagan's fame deserved? What did he do, and how did he come to be for so many the best president in history? Today on Visual Economic, we tell you all about it. But first, as someone who's been making YouTube videos for a few years now, I know there's a lot that happens behind the scenes to make it all possible. Recently though, we discovered a tool called InVideo AI. It's the world's most popular AI video creator, with over 10 million users in more than 150 countries. It's the only tool I've tried that truly puts you in control and works like your personal assistant. But instead of just telling you about it, let me show you with an example. Simply ask InVideo to create a 3-minute video for YouTube, like one on why can't Europe compete with the USA and China? A topic we discussed just a few days ago.
Trade policies also play a significant role. The USA has numerous trade deals that favor its
And if something doesn't convince you, you can always make detailed edits as needed. Just go to the edit command box and type in your request. For example, you can translate the video to Spanish and add subtitles. It's that easy.
Estados Unidos y China tienen poblaciones y extensiones de...
By clicking the link in the description, the pinned comment, or on the QR code on the screen, you can create up to 4 videos for free on InVideo. However, they will come with a watermark. For just $20 a month, you'll get full access. And if you use my code, you'll get twice the number of video generation credits in your first month. It's much more affordable than buying all the tools separately. Plus, it includes a vast library of royalty-free material. A huge thanks to InVideo AI for sponsoring this video. And now let's get back to today's content. There are 2 things Ronald Reagan is remembered for. The first is his bad jokes about the USSR.
I can still remember my first Republican convention, Abraham Lincoln giving a speech that sent tingles down my spine.
But the second thing Reagan is remembered for is for having solved in one fell swoop the main concern of Americans: inflation. Remember that Reagan became president just after the oil crisis, and inflation, hovering around 13.5%, was by far the top concern of citizens, well above unemployment or crime. And if we add to that the collapse of the Bretton Woods international money management system and the disaster that Vietnam had been, well, we could say that Reagan's inheritance was not at all positive. This is partly why he won the election so easily. However, it presented him with serious challenges. However, during the Republican president's first term, this inflation figure fell to stabilize between 3 and 4%. This was a real record. The question is, what did Reagan do to solve inflation so quickly while previous presidents had been unable to do anything? Well, you see, during that time, it was still very fashionable to believe that high inflation meant very low unemployment. You could say that Keynesianism was the academic status quo. So many politicians believed that fighting inflation was not necessary. However, in the Reagan era, one of the protagonists who changed the course of history, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, was in the game. Volcker was what is known as an inflation hawk. He didn't believe in Keynesian theories, so, as a comparison, Javier Milei would look like a tepid social democrat beside him. Thus, upon his arrival at the Fed, Volcker implemented the largest interest rate hikes in history. At their highest point, they exceeded 20%. To give you an idea of how extreme this is, right now the Fed is debating whether rates need to be at 5.5 or 5.25, and this is the biggest rate hike since Volcker. Meanwhile, Japan has suffered an economic earthquake by going from negative 0.1 to 0%. Volcker's gamble was something completely radical, a gamble that led the country into a severe recession, yes, but which put an end to the inflation problem. And you may ask, what was Reagan's role in all this? Well, actually not too much, because contrary to what you may think, Reagan didn't actually choose Volcker as the head of the Federal Reserve. The one who did was Jimmy Carter, the previous president. In fact, the rate hike began right at the end of his term. Or to put it another way, Reagan cannot be credited with lowering inflation. If anything, his merit was renewing Volcker's mandate, and therefore maintaining Jimmy Carter's policies. And this is not a trivial matter, because Carter was a Democrat, but Reagan was a continuist. Unlike now, when presidents seem to insist that if one says one thing, the other has to defend the exact opposite. They are like children's fights that were unthinkable before. How times change, right? In any case, Reagan's economic policy did not end here. With the main problem of inflation solved, the former president promoted a new economic model, Reaganomics. Reaganomics had three main points: reduce the growth of federal spending, lower taxes, and eliminate regulation that held back economic growth. And as we say around here, said and done. In this graph, you could see the marginal income tax rate before and after the Reagan tax cut. As you can see, the tax cut benefited everyone, and it was very, very drastic. But I'm sure there's one thing that strikes you, and that is that it benefited the richest people much more. This has been called trickle-down economics, or voodoo economics, as Bush called it. The idea is that if you lower taxes on the rich, this will produce more economic activity and end up benefiting the poorest. For what reason? Well, in theory, because the rich invest more and generally have more skills to develop ventures. However, there is a nuance, because in reality, Reagan did not lower taxes on the rich as much as is claimed. That is, on paper, the tax rate went way down, but the president also greatly simplified the tax code, which made many tax traps that the rich used to avoid taxes disappear. Conclusion: it is estimated that the final collection increased by 2 cents for every dollar. This does not mean that taxes were secretly increased, because another thing to keep in mind is that tax simplification also makes it easier for citizens to pay taxes. What this means is that although Reagan lowered the tax burden, it was not as favorable to the rich as it is portrayed, nor did it result in a loss of revenue. What he did do was to create a simpler and more equitable model for all, with the idea that it would be fairer and also promote economic growth. And the question is, did economic activity really increase after this reform? The answer is apparently yes. In the following years, business activity grew by 11%, and GDP grew at rates of between 3.5 and 4.5%. Now, we've said apparently, and that's because this growth, there's something of a trick to it. We've said that Reagan lowered taxes a lot, about 2% of GDP. Well, what do you think happened to government spending? Well, Reagan increased it. This is paradoxical because today, the former president is remembered as the man who cut the welfare state. But the truth is that public spending continued to grow at exactly the same rate as before. As a result, the deficit soared above 5%, which, in part, dampened economic growth. Let's say that under Reagan, businesses and families fared better with lower taxes and less bureaucracy, but budget doping also played a role. And this is very important. In his speeches, Ronald Reagan was totally opposed to public debt. We could say that it was his greatest enemy after the Russians. But when it came down to it, he did not dare to cut much of the public spending he had planned. He was a very popular president, yes, but no voter likes to have his spending cut. And on the other hand, Reagan's economic team was divided between the traditional Republicans, who wanted to cut spending before lowering taxes, and a new group of economists who thought they could lower taxes, and that the economic boom resulting from lower taxes would eventually lead to higher revenues. And yes, among these economists came the famous curve that Arthur Laffer drew on a napkin to Chief of Staff Gerald Ford, although the idea is actually much older.
Taxes, sometimes by diminishing the consumption of the goods taxed, and sometimes by encouraging smuggling, frequently enable the government to raise a smaller amount of revenue than could be raised by more moderate taxes.
Theoretically, the Laffer curve situation can occur. No one disputes that. But the US has never had taxes so high that lowering them would increase revenue in the short term. And let's be clear, the Reagan team, for the most part, also knew that the Laffer effect was, at least in the short term, a pipe dream. And do you know what they did to avoid losing credibility? They started to use the famous magic asterisks. That is, in the government budgets, they put asterisks in many expenditure items to say, this expenditure here, we have not really cut it yet, but we will do it in the future. Of course, the cuts never came. What we can say is that Reagan did cut some wasteful spending. For example, he eliminated $500 million worth of travel expenses for politicians. And along with other measures, the federal government saved an estimated $46 billion. Now, $46 billion sounds like a lot of money, but we are talking about the same amount of money that went into the increased defense budget alone, which was vital in the fight against the USSR. But contrary to popular belief, defense spending did not skyrocket under Reagan either. At its peak, it only increased by 1 point, which is not small, but not barbaric either. Conclusion? In just one term, the US went from being a net creditor to the country that borrowed the most, not bad for the biggest enemy of public debt, although it must be said that the particularly high interest rates in the United States had a lot to do with this change. But of course, Reagan still had a secret weapon: deregulation. As in many countries, Reagan was convinced that the US had laws that prevented businesses from growing. Therefore, if he eliminated those laws, he could achieve economic growth without having to cut pensions, healthcare, or anything like that. The question is, did he make it? Yes, there was an important deregulation of the financial sector, which was the sector with the best growth rate in the country, and which has been key until now. But apart from that, it was not that big a deal. The curious thing is that this clashes with its predecessor. Do you remember that it was Jimmy Carter who nominated Paul Volcker? As it turns out, it was also Carter who carried out the major deregulations of the era. We're talking about eliminating price controls in the energy sector, opening up competition in the railroads, and above all in the airlines. To give you an idea, this measure caused the price of airline tickets to fall by 10 to 20%. Come on, Carter even deregulated the production of alcoholic beverages. So if we are to compare, the big push for deregulation was not born with Reagan, although Reagan did develop, expand, and implement the deregulations initiated by Carter. Do you remember what we said before about Reagan being a continuist who knew how to keep the good things from his predecessor? Well, that's just it. And of course, this is not to say that Reagan was without great merit. There is their battle against the Soviets, or the improvements in the labor market. Closely related to the latter, for example, another problem that is hardly talked about is the crisis of the air traffic controllers. They went on a huge strike that threatened to paralyze air traffic in the country. The strike was completely illegal, but the president himself gave them 48 hours to return to work. However, most air traffic controllers did not comply. So there were more than 11,000 layoffs, which were quickly replaced by military and new express positions. In other words, the country looked like it was going to be paralyzed, but Reagan managed to save the situation in time. But hey, these kinds of stories are much less relevant than macroeconomic policy. The point is that in economics, the best presidents do not usually enjoy the results of their actions. It takes a long time for the effects of policies to take hold, and there is no better example than the deficit and debt. Until the Reagan era, interest payments on debt were closely tied to inflation. This is easy to explain. More inflation means higher interest rates, and with higher interest rates, governments borrow less. However, with Reagan, this rule was broken. Remember that Volcker shot up interest rates, but despite this, Reagan continued to put the country into debt. The problem is that since Reagan was still spending, the Fed could not lower rates, because if it did, inflation could skyrocket. However, in other countries, such as the UK and Japan, rates were lower than in the US. And what happens when rates are higher in one country than in the rest? Well, investors bring their money to the country with higher interest rates to get more yield, and that makes the currency, in this case the dollar, increase its price a lot. And I know what many of you are thinking. What's the problem with the dollar strengthening? American exports plummeted. Thus, in 1985, for the first time in peacetime since World War II, the US trade balance turned negative. The country imported $449 billion worth of goods, but exported only $370 billion. So in a way, Reagan did change the American economic model, but not towards an austere, ultra-capitalist country. And we haven't even gotten to the worst part yet. We already know that the export competitiveness of the US had collapsed because of its currency, and productivity was not growing at a very good pace either. Partly because in 1986, Reagan passed a law to simplify the tax system and lower taxes for companies and families. This law also ended many deductions to compensate for the high deficit without touching social plans. And some of these changes hurt investment, which in net terms fell by 2%, its second largest drop during the post-war period. And how do you think Reagan reacted to the loss of foreign competitiveness? What did he do when Toyota cars became much better than Ford's? Or when IBM's processors lost market share to the Japanese? Well, once again, the opposite of what he promised. Reagan declared himself to be a great defender of free trade, and it is true that he reached important trade agreements with countries such as Canada and Israel. But with Japan, he went all out with Japan. Reagan declared a trade war against his ally on a par with the current war with China. To put a concrete chaos, he put tariffs on Japanese electronic products in excess of 100%. Like today, semiconductors were also a strategic industry back then. The difference is that in the 1980s, the US still dominated the international market, although it was losing more and more influence. So I ask you again, what did Ronald Reagan do? Again, the opposite of what he had promised. Industrial policy. In 1987, he brought together the latest microchip companies in the country, Intel, IBM, AMD, and showered them with public money, but the project was a complete failure. The managers of these companies spent more time in Washington thinking about how they could get more public money than working on improving their microchips. In fact, economist Douglas Irwin estimates that the impact of public policy on the sector's productivity was not only small, but directly negative. Thus, the weight of the US in the semiconductor industry fell during the Reagan era from 70% to 40%. So with all this in mind, what can we say about the Reagan administration? Was it really a failure, all things considered? Well, evidently not. Reagan's tax changes fueled a wave of prosperity for families and businesses. In just 8 years, more than 20 million jobs were created, and financial deregulation made this industry a huge engine of growth. It is not strange that it was right around this time that the great technological boom that has ended up creating the largest business cluster in the history of mankind in the United States began to take place. Moreover, all this was achieved by curbing inflation, which was one of his great promises. The reality is that in economic terms, Reagan changed the US, basically turned it into the country it is today. But he neither changed it into an ultra-capitalist neoliberal power, nor did he cut public spending to let the poor die on the doorstep of hospitals. Reagan's main change was to turn the US into the world's largest borrower, something that in principle went against the president's philosophy, but which also has its role in the world. Today, only the US is able to offer the world such a safe and profitable asset as public debt in such massive amounts. And although the competitiveness of Americans declined, they also benefited from the economic growth in the rest of the world that occurred precisely because this asset was available. And perhaps the greatest of its successes are not so much in the economic field, but in the political field. For example, in its role vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. So now it's your turn. What do you think of Reagan? Do you think the tax cuts were positive, or should he have lowered government spending earlier? What other economic policies have we not had time to comment on? You can leave your answers in the comments, and don't forget that here at Visual Economic, we upload videos every week. If you like the video, please like and subscribe to not miss the next one. Best regards, and I'll see you in the next one.